Welcome to the last part of the discussion on accounting for franchise operations on the franchisor books. So, on the previous discussion video, we ended on the illustration, uh, a, a realistic illustration related to the recognition of the initial services, the administrative expenses, and how do we account for the initial franchise fees and the continuing franchise fee. So let us look now at illustration 3. What about when there are variable considerations included in the franchise contract? So an entity enters into a contract with a customer for two licenses, X and Y, which the entity determines to represent two performance obligations each satisfied at a point in time. So the standalone selling prices of licenses are 800 and 1,000 respectively. So when we say standalone, kung kung ibebenta yung isang license, for example, license X, 800 lang siya. Kung ibebenta yung license Y, 1,000. So ganun siya. Kung kaya siya stand-alone selling prices. So on case 1, the variable consideration allocated entirely to one performance obligation. So the contract states a fixed consideration of 800 for license X and 3% sales-based royalty for license Y. So dahil ito ay nakasama, kumbaga, ang binili is 2 licenses. So normally, magkakaroon dyan ng discount dahil dalawang license ang binibili sa'yo. So, ayan ang naka-state sa contract. 800 daw for license X and then 3% sales-based royalty naman for license Y. Pero kung ibebenta mo siya standalone, 1,000 lang yung 1,000 yung Y. Ganun siya. So, bakit pinipresent itong standalone selling prices? Later on, we will look at that. So, for purpose of allocation, the entity estimates its sales-based royalties to be 1,000. So, anong gamit nitong data na sales-based royalty? This is the basis for the 3% sales-based royalty sa license Y. Okay? Okay, let us read the analysis for this as we account for the variable considerations. Yung 800 fixed consideration daw kay license X at yung 1,000 na estimated variable consideration reflect the stand-alone selling prices. Okay? Therefore, the entity shall allocate the 800 fixed consideration entirely to license X and the sales-based royalty entirely to license Y. The entity shall recognize the 800 fixed consideration as revenue when license X is transferred to the customer and the sales-based royalty when the subsequent sales occur. So based on this case, yung 800 will be the standalone selling price for X and then yung 1,000 na sales-based royalty ang magiging basis natin for license Y. Okay? Next, under case number 2, variable consideration allocated on the basis of standalone selling prices. So, tingnan na mo yung difference niya. Kanina, the 800, this is the fixed consideration for license X, tapos kay Y is sales-based royalty na 3%. Ano ang ginamit mo dyan? 800 fixed consideration for X and then 1,000. Asan yung 1,000? Ito, the 1,000 yung estimated variable consideration for license Y. Okay? Case number 2, the contract states a fixed consideration of 300 for license X and 5% sales-based royalty for license Y. So, for purposes of allocation, the entity estimates that its sales-based royalty are to be 1,500. So, license Y is transferred to the customer at contract inception. So, kung nagsimula ngayon na i-transfer yung license Y, pero yung license X ay 3 months later pa. So, how do we account for this? The 300 fixed consideration for license X and the 1,500 estimated variable consideration for license Y do not reflect the stand-alone selling prices na 800 and 1,000. Kanina kasi on case number 1, the numerical figures 800 and 1,000, they reflect the stand-alone selling prices initially identified. Diba? Walang problema kasi kung magkano yung standalone selling prices, they reflect still the amounts ng variable consideration. However, in this case, magkaiba yung amounts na nakapresent sa'yo. They do not reflect the standalone 801,000. So, paano gagawin mo dyan? Ang gagawin mo lang is to allocate po yung fixed consideration na 300 for X and yung license Y on the basis of the standalone selling prices. Next, and then you allocate the sales-based royalty to license X and the license Y on the basis also of their standalone selling prices. So, paano ang treatment doon? Yung pong 300, i-allocate mo kay X and Y. Tapos yung sales-based royalty, i-allocate mo kay X and Y. Ganun siya. Okay. Paano siya i-allocate? Please take a look at the tabulation. Tingnan mo po. Ito yung standalone selling price is 801,000. Then you allocate your 300 na fixed consideration. At ganun din po doon sa iyong sales-based royalty. So, based on this, the allocated amounts is 133 and 167. Dahil si license Y ay, di ba ang sabi dito, it will be transferred at contract inception, magre-recognize ka ng revenue at contract inception. Kaya nga, the 167 allocated to license is recognized as revenue at contract inception. Yung revenue naman, ito, yung 133 for X, ay i-recognize mo pa 3 months after. Okay? Kasi ang sabi dito, it will be transferred 3 months later. Okay? Next, how do we now allocate yun namang sales-based royalty na naka-identify dyan? Okay, in the first month, the customer made total sales of 4,000. So, this is an additional information. So, kung 4,000 ang sales, you multiply it to 5%, that would be your royalty. Yun yung amount ng royalty. Okay, 4,000 times 5%. That is 200. So, yung 200 po na yun, i-allocate natin doon kay X and Y based on their standalone selling prices. Kaya ito yun. So, inallocate po siya. 800 over 1,800. So, 89 and 111 for X and Y respectively. Okay? Yung 111 will be recognized to license Y as revenue because at contract inception yan. And yung 89 will be recognized as initially as a contract liability and will be recognized as revenue only when after 3 months. Kasi ita-transfer pa lang sa customer yan later, 3 months later. Okay? So, ganun po yung pag-recognize. So, when you meet problems related na binibigyan ka ng standalone selling prices, mga variable consideration, this will be your guide as you compute for the items. Normally, ang tatanungin naman dyan is yung magkano yung revenue na nire-recognize on the first year, on the second, and the succeeding years. Ganun. Ganun ang treatment. Next, the contract cost. The contract cost will include your incremental cost of obtaining a contract and the cost to fulfill the contract. So, essentially, yung incremental cost, yan lang naman yung mai-incur mo as you proceed with the contract. Diba? Kung hindi ka magpo-proceed sa contract, wala kang ganyan. Wala kang mai-incur na cost. Cost to fulfill the contract, these are costs that are related in the accomplishment of the contract. Yung mismong the process, the cost in the processing of the contract, yung mismong pag-execute mo na doon sa contract na yan. Okay? Amortization and impairment, this happens when there are changes on the values related to the items in the contract. So let us take a look at the illustration. So on December 1, ABC grants a customer a license to use ABC's patented technology over a 4-year period. The contract price is 1 million. Okay, during December, meron siyang direct contract cost 120 and indirect cost 30. The customer obtains control of the license on January 2. So January 2 pa nakuha yung control of the license. Case 1, right to use. The license provides the customer the right to use ABC's intellectual property as it exists at the time the license is granted. So kapag right to use yan, you have to identify that how do we journalize the transaction? How do we treat this? On December 1, at the grant of the customer license, you debit cash, 1 million, then credit contract liability. Okay? And then, on December of 20x1, you have to recognize yung mga direct and indirect costs related to the contract. Debit deferred contract cost, 120,000. Debit expense for the indirect cost na dinidiretso ka agad sa expense accounts, 30,000, and then credit cash. Okay? On 20x2, nung January 2, dun na nakuha yung control of the license. Okay? So, debit contract liability, credit revenue, 1 million. So, tinransfer mo from liability to revenue. On January 2 also, you debit cost of license as an expense account and then credit deferred contract cost, 120. So, tinransfer mo lang ulit at the time na na-control na yung license. Okay? When it is right to access, okay, the license provides the customer the right to access as it exists throughout the license period. ABC uses a time-based method in measuring its progress towards the completion of the obligation. Okay, on January 2, wala pong end. On 20x1, same recognition. Okay? On 20x2, walang entry. Bakit wala? Because no revenue is recognized on January 2 because the performance obligation is satisfied over time. ABC will start recognizing revenue and amortizing the related deferred costs on January 31. Kasi nag-start pa lang dito yung pag-control dun sa license. So, ibig sabihin, hindi ka pa pwedeng mag-recognize ng revenue kasi start mo pa lang ng control. So, dapat may period muna. Kaya nga, January 31 para isang buwan na siya. So, you will recognize revenue for the month of January. Ganon. So, in this case, wala ka pang recognition of revenue. Unlike here, kasi ito ay right to use, kaya nag-recognize ka na dyan. On 20x, okay, no revenue. On January 31, how do we recognize? I-amortize mo po. Yan. Debit contract liability, credit revenue, 20,833.33. Paano po yan na-compute? 1 million divided by 4 years times 1 over 12. So, kinuha po yung ratio and proportion related dyan. Kasi 4-year period ito. Okay? So, kailangan maging mindful ka if it is a right to use, a right to access case. Debit cost of license, credit deferred contract cost, 2,500. Also, prorated. Okay? Or amortized. Okay, some items I think you have to look it at yourself because this is only a repetition of what we have already discussed. Especially yung significant financing component in a contract. We already have discussed some items related to this on the construction contract discussion, yung significant financing component. Remember, we are still under PFRS 15, yung revenue from contracts with customers. Okay? You have to look for the present value items. Okay. So what happens when there are items that are uncertain of the collectibility? If the uncertainty in the collectibility of the contract revenue arises at contract inception, the contract would not qualify under step 1 and thus no revenue is recognized. Any consideration received is a liability. The contract is continued to be reassessed as if it subsequently meets the criteria. If the uncertainty arises subsequent to the contract inception, the uncollectibility is accounted for as impairment of receivable or the contract asset. So, kung titingnan mo itong illustration related to the uncertainty of the collectibility, bibigyan ka dyan ng data ng fixed fee, yung license, kung anong information, if it's right to use, right to access, ganyan. And then, bibigyan ka ng conditions, whether the items are probable of collection, doubtful, or significantly uncertain. So, how do we analyze contracts such as this? So, let us look. Step 1, contracts and 1 and 2 meet the criteria while the contract 3 does not. Okay? Step 2, all the contracts are satisfied at a point in time. Step 3, the transaction price is determined as follows. Step 4, the transaction price in each contract is allocated to the performance obligation to transfer the license. It's step 5, we recognize revenue related dyan sa collectability. Okay? For contract 1 and 2, recognize mo lang yung transaction price related to that kapag na-transfer na yung license sa customer. On contract 3, hindi mo siya no revenue is recognized. The down payment and any subsequent collection from the note is recognized as a liability and recognized as revenue only when either of the following has occurred. Yung ABC has no remaining obligation to transfer the license to the customer, and all or substantially all. Next, the contract has been terminated and consideration received is non-refundable. So kung ma-accomplish ito, pwede mo siyang i-recognize as a revenue. Okay? So how do we journalize the transactions on January 1? We debit cash 20,000, debit notes receivable 80,000, credit revenue 80,747, then credit unearned interest 19,253, customer 2, and then customer 3 as follows. Okay? This is based on the computation here at step 3. Okay, let us take a look at the illustration, yung the commentary on the old accounting and then related dun sa PFRS 15. In case of significant uncertainty in the collection of revenue, the cost recovery method may be used in lieu of the installment sales method. Under the cost recovery, profit from the franchise agreement is recognized when cash collections exceed the direct cost incurred on the franchise. So itong related installment sales method will be discussed on the succeeding modules. But I want to have an emphasis on this kasi kapag significantly uncertain yung collection doon sa revenue, it is not proper to recognize revenue kasi we will violate yung conservatism principle. It is apparent na mayroong na mas mataas yung cost. So, kailangan i-recover muna natin yun under the concept of the cost recovery method. Okay? Which also follows yung concept ng zero profit method as discussed in the previous chapter. Okay? Okay, how about the repossessed franchises? When we say repossessed franchises, so kumbaga terminate yung franchise agreement at binalik doon sa original possession. Okay? Hindi pinursue yung franchise agreement. So let us look. A franchisor grants a franchise the right to operate a restaurant over 10-year period using the franchisor's trademark and proprietary processes in exchange for 100,000 upfront fee and 10% royalty. The only performance obligation in the contract is the promise to grant the license and this is satisfied over time. Case 1, termination daw before commencement. So bago pa nagsimula, terminate na. The contract gives the 180 days from the signing of the contract to commence. However, failure to do so would result to the termination of the contract. So upon termination, the franchisor refunds 20% of the upfront fee. So that is based on the agreement. So kung hindi ka tutuloy, babalik ko 20% lang. The franchisee fails to commence operations within the time frame and thus the franchisor terminates the contract. So how do we recognize this? Okay. At the point of view, since we are the franchisor, you debit cash, credit contract liability, 100,000 noong contract inception. Nung terminate niya at hindi niya sinimulan, anong gagawin mo? I-eliminate mo lang yung liability kasi hindi natutuloy. Debit contract liability, 100,000. Debit, credit cash, ito po yung binayad mo. 100,000 times 20%, yung nirefund mo doon sa franchisee, 20,000. And then credit gain on contract cancellation. So, ibig sabihin, kumita ka doon. Kasi hindi mo na yan i-refund. 80,000. Okay, what happens when there is a termination after commencement? So, anong mga reason? Pwedeng, ito, yung abandonment, insolvency, foreclosure, criminal conviction, failure to make payments, misuse of trademark, unauthorized disclosure of secret processes, repeated non-compliance with policies, and unauthorized transfer. So, there are several cases. So, maka-identify mo naman yan based on sa date na nakalagay sa problem mo. So, how do you recognize? Yan. At contract inception, debit cash, credit contract liability, 100,000. At the end of year 1, kung nag-generate ng revenue, the debit contract liability, credit revenue, 10,000. End of year 2, debit contract liability, credit revenue, 10,000. At contract termination, how do we recognize it? Debit contract liability, magkano yung balance niya, 80,000, and then credit revenue, 80,000. Okay, let's take a look at the notes. The royalties are ignored to simplify the illustration. On contract termination, the franchisor may need to test any receivable recognized on the sales-based royalty for impairment. The PFRs are not clear whether the 80,000 balance of the contract liability is recognized as revenue or as a gain. So, according to Milan, ay ginamit niya yung term na revenue as this parallels the old accounting treatment under GAAP FAS number 45. So, in case 1, do sa diniscuss natin kanina, itong case number 1, di ba gumamit siya ng gain? Okay? So, kung gumamit ka ng gain dyan before the termination before commencement, therefore, it would be more appropriate because the contract is terminated before the franchisee is able to use and obtain the economic benefits from the license. So, there is a gray area still here. So, most probably, kapag mga ganyan, hindi yan masyadong lumalabas sa board exam kapag may items related to of contest. Kumbaga, pwede pang i-contest. So, more or less, ang tatanungin sa'yo dyan is how much is the recognized or the reversed contract liability related to the item. Ito. So, normally, ang tatanungin dyan is ito. Yung contract liability na na-reverse at the end of at the termination of the contract. Okay? So, yan. So, some items are summarized here for the chapters related to franchise operation. So, bakit binibigyan ng focus itong franchisor books? Because, normally, yung recognition kasi ng accounting treatment for franchisor ay naiiba, kaya siya naka-include pa dito sa special transactions. Yung franchisee books will be discussed on I think on I don't know kung kasama siya before sa accounting for business combination, but before kasi yung context ng advanced accounting andun lahat. Dinidiscuss yung franchisor, franchisee, but for the special transactions, binigyan ng emphasis yung franchisor books because it mas special yung recognition kapag franchisor ka. Kapag kasi franchisee ka, you just have to recognize as expense, revenue, ganon. So, there are instances kasi na pwedeng ma-terminate yung franchise agreement, pwedeng nagsimula na yung franchise agreement, then tsaka i-terminate. So, these are unique accounting processes na pagdadaanan ng isang accountant. So, it is imperative that you have to recognize itong mga special transactions na ito as you go along with the your accounting journey and your sipale. Okay, some items are summarized here. I think we already have identified all of this. So, it is for you to read na lang yung chapter 8 summary. So, I think that ends the discussion for the franchise operations. You have to still, as you listen to the discussion video, you have to still solve some items na hindi ko na masyadong in-emphasize because in the interest of time. Okay? Thank you, and please proceed with the next succeeding videos for more of the special transactions. Thank you.